Welcome everyone. We're really excited to be hosting this webinar and excited that you could join us today. My name is Libby Murphy. I'm the Deputy Policy Director at Minnesota Housing Partnership. And I'm very excited to immediately introduce you to Gabriela Norton. She is our research officer at Minnesota Housing Partnership, and she's going to be introducing us to the body of research that she's been working on for quite some time now, Market Watch, the Northland region. Gabriela?
Thank you, Libby. And welcome everyone. We are excited to talk to you a little bit about some trends in the Northland region. So I will be talking to you all about the Market Watch Northland Region report, trends in the unsubsidized multifamily rental market. So we're going to be looking at a number of different risk indicators for upscaling and displacement. In this research report, we track key trends in the unsubsidized multifamily rental markets of the Northland Arrowhead region. And also want to preface that for the purposes of this report, we use the term NOAH, or naturally occurring affordable housing, which refers to unsubsidized properties that have rents that are affordable to households with incomes at 60% of area median income. And these properties are important because they do not have subsidy. They are not required to keep rents affordable to any particular income. Rents may change due to the sale of a property, improvements to property, change in market conditions, or other owner decisions. Next slide, please. So a little bit about MHP, Minnesota Housing Partnership, was founded in 1989. We convene, guide, and support a diversity of partners working to improve conditions of home and community. Next slide. While we are rooted in Minnesota, as you can see, a number of our technical assistance engagements around the state. Next slide. We also work nationwide. And next slide. So we have three areas of focus. Research, so we produce research to make the case for investing in home and community. We also advance policy solutions for affordable housing. And our community development team works directly with communities to achieve local housing and development goals. And next slide. So a bit about the Market Watch series. The series began in 2018 out of the need to quantify and locate NOAH properties to better understand the dynamics of these properties and track trends that may affect rent increases or potentially displace people. We also wanted to better understand the dynamics of the renter populations who rely on NOAH to call home. We've had 6 issues so far that we've released: Minneapolis, St. Paul, Dakota County, forms of NOAH in the 7-county metro, Hennepin County, and Washington County. And our 7th issue is this Northland issue, which is our first issue outside of the 7-county metro. So this report covers the Northland region. The Northland region is located in the northeastern area of the state, and it spans 7 counties. It also includes the Duluth MSA and 3 Native American reservations, including Bois Forte, Fond du Lac, and Grand Portage. So currently there are about 35,746 total renters in the region. This accounts for just over a quarter of the total household population, and we've seen a 21% increase in total number of renters since 2000. But rent is out of reach for many of these lower and modest income households. The Northland region contains the highest percent of cost burden renters in the state. 3 counties see some of the highest rates of renter cost burden in the state, and those include Itasca, KOOTASCA, and St. Louis, where at least half to 55% of renters spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Additionally, 4 counties rank worst for severe renter cost burden. In Aitkin, Itasca, KOOTASCA, and St. Louis, where at least a quarter of renters are paying over half of their income on housing. Of the 10 most, can you go back, Brian? Of the 10 most populous cities in the region, Hermantown has the highest percentage of cost burden renters, followed by Virginia and Grand Rapids. And then what this graphic is looking at, when we're looking at NOAA, we're looking at really the renter population that is earning around 50,000 or less, so renter families. In the region, 69% of renter households, or 23,721 families, earn less than 50,000 annually. And so of those households, 63% are cost burdened or are paying more than they can afford on housing. And next slide. Renter income is lower than the state average in every county in the Northland region, with Itasca County ranking lowest in the state for current renter median income. In the region, 32% of renter households earn less than 20,000 annually, meaning these families have no more than $500 per month to spend on housing without exceeding 30% of their annual income. And there isn't a single county in the Northland region where that is enough to afford a modest 1-bedroom apartment. I just want to note that there is one kind of outlier in the region. Lake County has seen very significant increases in renter income in the state, most likely due to higher income renters moving into that county to kind of occupy rental homes and vacation homes. Next slide. Households of color are disproportionately impacted. As we know, households of color are more likely to be renters. So in the Northland region, 54% of households of colors are renters, compared to 23% of white households that are renters. And then the graphic below is actually for the statewide, but we've seen these trends to hold true around the state. There are major disparities between median income when you look at race, with Black, Native, and Hispanic households earning on average significantly less than white and Asian households. Next slide. And a lot of these trends are not moving in a positive direction. Earnings for Black, Native, and Hispanic households have declined, while white and Asian households have seen increases since 2000. And I also want to note that everything in this report and PowerPoint are adjusted for inflation. So when we're talking about changes over time, that is all adjusted for inflation. And then next slide. Most in-demand jobs struggle to be able to afford both renting or owning. So this chart looks at the top 5 in-demand jobs specific to the Northland region in the year 2020. So as you can see, rental or retail salespersons, registered nurses, home and health personal care aides, retail sales supervisors, and pharmacy technicians were the top in-demand jobs in the region. We've seen changes this year. Obviously, because of the pandemic, we typically would be seeing food prep and server workers, but those have fallen out of the top in-demand jobs, as we know. As you can see here, only registered nurses are able to afford both the salary needed to own a median priced home in the region and the salary needed to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. Something else that is of concern here is that some of these positions, like particularly health and personal care aides, are expected to see the most growth over the next 10 years. I think they have one of the highest rates of growth of all occupations, and yet their annual salary is just $27,244 in the region. So that will be a serious issue for those workers to be able to find and access affordable homes. And next slide. But there is time to preserve these affordable units. So here we have mapped out NOAA properties around the region. So these properties are properties that are affordable to a family of 4 earning under $50,400 annually. They are able to call the Northland Region home by renting in unsubsidized apartments in the private market. In total, 41% of the units in our data set contained apartments that are affordable to those earning under 60% of AMI, and that is relative to bedroom size, of course. By number, Duluth, Grand Rapids, Cloquet, and Hibbing contain the most units affordable to these families. As you can see, there are clusters in Duluth, but also throughout the Iron Range. These buildings are typically quite old. 92% of NOAA buildings were built prior to 2000 in our data set, and the average year built for these properties is 1953, which I'll also note is much older than the average year built for NOAA properties in the Twin Cities, which is more like 1960s, 1970s. The average Northland NOAA building is about 36 units and are kind of primarily smaller properties that are all Class C. And next slide. So here we have kind of a closer look at NOAA properties clustered in Duluth. So these are Duluth neighborhoods outlined. You can see that there are clusters of NOAA properties in some of these neighborhoods that have lower median household income. So Central Hillside Park Point particularly has the lowest median household income in the city, and it has the highest volume of NOAA properties. We also see some properties out in West Duluth and up into Piedmont and Duluth Heights, Kenwood. And if you keep that map in mind and then look at the next, you'll see that there are trends between where these NOAA properties are and where there are areas of significant renter cost burden. So we're seeing some of the same neighborhoods that we just saw that have high volumes of NOAA properties and also high volumes of cost burden renters. So looking at East Hillside, Central Hillside, those neighborhoods have at least half of their renter population that are cost burdened. And next slide. So NOAA units are particularly scarce when looking at larger bedrooms to house families. This chart indicates the kind of distribution of NOAA units that we tracked around the region and breaks it out by bedroom size. So the majority of NOAA units in the region are 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom. 44% of all of these units are 1, and 37% of all of these units are 2 bedroom. Therefore, larger affordable units are far more scarce, with only 7% of all NOAA units, or 3 bedrooms only account for 7% of all of these NOAA units. And we only counted 14 total qualifying NOAA units for 4 bedrooms around the entire region. And next slide. Our vacancy rates show that there is a demand for these affordable units. When vacancy rates fall below 5%, renter households struggle to find affordable housing. This is because property owners can be more selective in tenant screening and potentially increase rent. Vacancies have dropped in 8 out of the 10 cities with the most NOAA, which further constricts supply of available affordable rental homes. As you can see in this chart, Hermantown, Cloquet, Duluth have seen very significant declines where they are under 5%. We've also seen significant declines in Virginia and Evelyn. And then to the right, you can see that Class C properties have an extremely low vacancy rate in the region of just 2.7%. And next slide. One of the other risk indicators that we track are property sales. Property sales may reposition rents, and often NOAA properties are purchased with new owners. Rent comes and increases, especially while there may be just some cosmetic adjustments made. Oftentimes there are not the necessary kind of rehab that goes in, but prices will increase. So here we have a map of looking at some of the property sales that happened from 2010 to 2019, again for Duluth. And we've overlaid that there is a correlation between these property sales, again in these same neighborhoods that, as we saw before, have a lower median household income, have high rents or high rates of renter cost burden, and have some of the higher amounts of BIPOC population. And next slide. So when we're looking at overall housing stock for market rate multifamily in the region, there's a very significant amount that is Class C. Which is slightly different from what we're seeing in the Twin Cities. We're seeing a little bit more Class A properties than are represented here. But the majority of unsubsidized rental housing in the region are Class C, or these older properties that provide basic shelter without additional amenities. So in total, they account for 73% of all rental buildings. However, Class C rents are 13% lower than Class B rents in the region. And this is important because if a Class C building is purchased and upscaled to whatever degree, the result could result in a rise in rent. There are potential rent gains from upscaling, particularly among studios and 3 bedrooms where there is a more significant rent gap between Class B and Class C units. Next slide. Aging housing is a big concern in the region. The region has some of the oldest housing stock in the state by far. Multifamily market rate homes have over a 1/3 older than 100 years, which is pretty significant. And this is important because aging housing is much more vulnerable to repair concerns and may need reinvestment to be maintained as healthy and safe homes. And next slide. And new construction of new units of affordability are not filling the gap. From 2010 to 2019, only 15 new properties broke ground across the entire 7-county Northland region. So that's very, very few. And many years and many counties saw absolutely no new production over that time frame. Of those properties, just 4 were affordable, and new construction was largely limited to Duluth. We've heard that Duluth has, unique barriers that make construction of new market rate housing and housing at prices affordable to median incomes very difficult, some of which include cost of labor, cost of construction, and the unique geography in the area. And so there is this shortage of kind of new supply coming online. And I just want to also mention that of the properties that have been built, those command much higher rents. The average properties that have come on the market since 2010, average rent for those are $1,546, so $1,546. That's 42% higher than that of the regional existing average of rent. And as I mentioned, new construction is very largely limited to Duluth. Of those 15 properties, 12 were built in Duluth, 10 were constructed in the city of Duluth, and 2 were constructed in the city of Cloquet. These new construction properties were slightly larger with an average size of 85 units. And I also want to note that compared to the state number of multifamily permits issued in 2019, the Northland region accounted for just 3% of all new multifamily permits that were issued around the state. So a very, very small portion went to this part of the state. And next slide. This is particularly affecting for those at the lowest income. So the Northland region is home to 10,610 renter households that are extremely low income or earn less than 30% of area median income. And yet there are just 4,869 units that were affordable and available to renters in that income bracket. So there is a serious gap of units needed, particularly for those of the lowest income. And next slide. So I also wanted to touch on that this report was, the data was pulled, it was analyzed and written prior to COVID. But I think it makes clear that there were pre-existing pressures and cost burdens for renters in the region, particularly those of low and modest income, even prior to the pandemic. We will continue to see the impacts of the pandemic over the next months and years, but one thing is clear, the pandemic has illustrated how essential stable, affordable housing is to maintaining health and weathering one of these great health and economic challenges that we have experienced over the past year and a half. Next slide. So I just wanted to also mention some of our upcoming reports for MarketWatch. Some of the next reports that we're going to be working on will be looking at some other greater Minnesota metro areas, including Mankato, St. Cloud, and Moorhead. And we're always interested to hear kind of what your ideas are for areas of interest as well. And then I think we have some time for questions before we move on to panelists.
Well, thank you, Gabriela. That was really enlightening. And I hope everyone found so too. So you and I talked about some questions, but I first want to go to a question in the chat from Dakota. And this might actually be a part of one of your answers to something that we had talked about earlier, but Dakota is wondering, has there been any efforts from the panelists to track NOAH properties that are single family homes or duplexes? And to what scale these smaller properties make up the NOAH landscape in the Northland region?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and was something that I also wanted to mention that I think we had talked about, which is this report tracks properties that are 4+ units. So there is that shadow market of what Dakota referenced, single family homes, and duplexes that are also rental homes that were not incorporated into this report. I think that is something that I didn't have access to the data for, but would definitely be a piece that would need to be examined to kind of get a better understanding of what is happening in those shadow market homes, particularly now. And I think we possibly have some input from our panelists about trends that they've been seeing throughout the past year with acquisition or converting previously owned single family homes to rental market to act as kind of a new supply for the rental market.
Great. And I think some of our panelists in the next panel might touch a little bit upon that as well. And I just want to note that there's some other questions in the chat, which I believe are a little bit of outside of Gabriela's scope. So I'm not trying to ignore them. But so Gabriela, if you had access to all the data that you needed, what would you further explore based on what you found in the Northland report and through this research that you did over the past few years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think most certainly would be looking at that shadow market data. I think that there are a lot of single family homes and duplexes that are acting as rental homes in the region. So that's a whole kind of other market that would be needed to be explored. I think some other things that I'm curious about that we've heard kind of anecdotally that we hopefully will be able to get some answers to when the 2020 census is released this December, which will be kind of thinking about population trends. Were people moving to Duluth from the Twin Cities to kind of get away from the Twin Cities during the pandemic? And if so, if those were kind of higher income renters, how did they affect local markets? That's something that I'm going to be very curious to see how that plays out once we kind of get that data, because I think we've heard about people seeking, kind of homes or vacation homes in the Northland region in particular.
Great. And based on some of your research, what concerns, if any, you kind of touched a little bit upon the fact that some of the NOAH housing stock is aging, and there's some concerns around kind of maintenance, rehab needs of those existing properties. So you touched upon it a little bit, but what concerns do you have about NOAH housing stock in the Northland?
Yeah, I think the NOAA housing stock is very old in the Northland region. So there are a lot of concerns about quality of housing there. I think we've heard that there are a lot of barriers to providing rehab for these properties, that it's very expensive, can cost as much as new construction. And so it seems like there is a gap between being able to kind of provide basic repairs to kind of really aging housing stock. I think there's also a concern that houses will become uninhabitable and then end up sitting vacant while, there is a real need for housing. So that's also another concern for sure. And I think, there are also concerns of, health and quality, and how housing that is aging may exacerbate other inequities as well.
Great. I'm curious to hear, and I think that we have time for one last question before we have to move on to our panel. I'm curious to hear if you have any recommendations, whether or not they're policy-based recommendations or research-based recommendations, and kind of next steps for the region as it uses this body of research as a resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. What the report indicates is that there is an existing pool of NOAA currently in Duluth and the region. I think the region will probably need to start planning some advanced solutions to prevent potential displacement if people are moving to the area and we start to see displacement from property sales or from NOAA aging out of affordability. I think there also probably needs to be some planning around these concerns that I'd mentioned around rehabbing and making housing, aging housing more of quality, how to address concerns of quality and health, and also issues of equity as well.
Great. Yeah, I've been thinking as we've been talking about your report and how this could be used as a resource for policymakers and for people in the region to plan and prepare, before, because I think about when we came up to Duluth and kind of the Iron Range over a year ago, pre-pandemic, and had some initial conversations with community partners. NOAA wasn't on a lot of people's radar, but your data is suggesting that yes, NOAA acquisitions and sales are happening, but maybe what isn't clear as to what extent people have been displaced as a result of those sales. And what we don't want is what we saw in the Twin Cities, is these triggering events where 600 families were displaced. And we also there may not be that opportunity. So it's easy for NOAA to kind of go under the radar in a community when you have smaller properties that are the ones that are being sold and acquired, and then we see the rent increases. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Gabriela. And Gabriela is going to be on. So if you have additional questions for her in the chat, I encourage you to use this opportunity to engage with her there, as well as her email is now on screen. I'm going to be turning to our panel of practitioners and community experts. We have Daryl Olson with the American Indian Community Housing Organization, Pam Kramer with LISC Duluth, and Isaac Meyer of KOOTASCA Community Action. I'm going to ask all of them to just very briefly introduce themselves, a minute or less, before we dive into the questions that we have for them. So Daryl, I will start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daryl Olson. I'm the Director of Programming at the American Indian Community Housing Organization, which is located in Duluth, Minnesota. We are a nonprofit that started in 1993 that run permanent supportive housing, domestic violence shelter, and new developments for housing as well.
Thanks, Daryl. Isaac, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I am Isaac Meyer. I'm the Planning and Development Director for KOOTASCA Community Action. We are a human service organization serving Itasca and Coochin counties here in the Northland region. Our services range from everything from Head Start and energy assistance to our housing programs, where we operate some affordable housing, transitional housing, as well as crisis housing supports, and do some housing developments in some of the communities we serve.
Thanks. All right, Pam. Hey, Pam, I know you're on.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. I'm Pam Kramer. I'm the Executive Director of Local Initiative Support Corporation in Duluth. And LISC is a national community development intermediary. Our focus is on creating resilient and inclusive communities of opportunity. And we're one of 37 local sites. And we believe that in order to have healthy, resilient communities, it takes more than one issue, and affordable housing is a key part of that. So we take a comprehensive approach. We work with residents, we work with nonprofits and the public sector and the private sector to ensure the community accesses safe, affordable housing, quality education, jobs, digital access, and healthy food, and much more.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you again to our panelists for joining us. So Pam, I'm going to start with you. So the Northland report really focused on NOAA, but it also shed light on how tight the rental market is and how production isn't keeping up with demand and all these other trends and these pressures in the market. And I know that through conversations that we've had, that those have been some of the areas that you've been more focused on. I'm just curious how LISC is thinking about current needs and supporting future growth, and then how this body of research might influence your work moving forward, if at all.
Sure. Well, in Duluth, NOAA is a tough thing to look at because there are so many small rental properties and many single-family homes that have been carved into rental properties as well. So we have not taken a real clear, there is not locally a NOAA strategy, but there certainly is a recognition that there's a shortage of affordable housing. And there's a very, very strong comprehensive approach at this point to look at how do we preserve what we have, how do we create additional units, how do we ensure that we're addressing, as was pointed out in Gabriela's report, we are missing additional affordable housing. The new housing that's being built is largely higher income, higher rents, and that's a concern. One example is also really focusing on how our number of people that are on the coordinated entry priority list, who are people that are in need of supportive housing or very affordable housing, continues to grow. It's 1,319 households right now. And in 2020, that number I'm sorry, in 2018, that number was 885. So there's been a huge growth and need for very affordable housing. So that's a concern. We are working, right now, we've created a study that's looking at, and we're working together with the city to create a Duluth Housing Trust Fund. And we're excited about some potential of some state funding that will support that. But we're also looking at with the creation of that fund, what are initiatives like small rental properties that we haven't been able to provide? They're not eligible for low-income housing tax credits. There really aren't state programs that are available to help support that, or there's very few resources. So how do we make sure that we're designing this housing trust fund in partnership with the city? This is LISC and the city and the community to meet those needs. And those are just a few examples.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, I feel like this issue of smaller size multifamily is a topic that I keep hearing more and more about, especially, well, really in all parts of the state. There's really no resources, as you said. So it's
Gabby, I don't know if I can add one more
go.
comment, but we are looking at innovative tools like smaller lots. The city has changed their zoning for new construction. We're looking at tiny home communities. We're looking at how do we ensure that one trend we're seeing is that the housing prices are going up in traditionally affordable neighborhoods. How do we make sure that we're building on the One Roof Community Land Trust program? How do we explore potentially new tools like co-op housing? So looking at all types of strategies, because clearly there's a shortage and there's a need to preserve our existing housing and ensure that we're not pricing people out of the market.
Thanks, Pam. Daryl, I'm turning to you next. So one of the biggest concerns about a NOAH property sale is the potential displacement of families. And I know that you and Gabriela have talked about some of the work that you've had to do to relocate individuals and families, not necessarily as a result of a NOAH property sale, but because of the lack of affordable housing. And if we think about if a sale were to displace families and there's such a small inventory of available and affordable units, that might be something that would have to occur. And can you speak to what impact a relocation has on a family, to the larger family or the community? And has this been exacerbated since COVID?
Yes, well, to speak what Pam had mentioned, there's 1,319 households on the coordinated entry waiting list. So, I mean, it has been exacerbated since COVID, definitely in our area. And relocating someone has a substantial impact on them. That we're relocating people who lack support in a new area. They lack resources, often are leaving a job because they can't find housing in their area. So their kids are being dispersed, changing schools, having then to reconnect to online learning. They're having to reestablish all of their medical and primary care. In a 6-month time period, AICHO had to work with 104 households specifically through our domestic violence shelter, because we were unable to serve them within our shelter space or find something local that they could get into. And we've located people across Minnesota, but we've also had to locate families to other parts of the country where we could luckily find some supports and families or some connections to them. And then I just want to add in the piece that when we're relocating people, we're also disconnecting them from their cultural connections. And that's a big piece, especially in the work that I do with the Indigenous community, is having to relocate someone and take them away from those cultural supports that they have. And, you know, we're often getting folks that are calling our DV shelter to relocate to Duluth. And the reality is if we have the space, we'll take anyone. But we're also very transparent of, you know, what it looks like here and how long a wait list is to get into long-term housing in our area. Because we don't want them just to put all their eggs in one basket, to say, and relocate all the way here just to have to return to somewhere else where maybe their abuser is known in that area, or, you know, they don't have the family or resources and supports that they.
Thanks, Daryl. Isaac, and this kind of gets to Dakota's question. The Northland report focuses on multifamily and renters, and some of the key takeaways are that the existing affordable housing stock is aging and almost no new affordable multifamily has been developed. Can you shed some light on other major trends happening with single family homes that are affordable? Are there more opportunities in this market, or are we seeing similar trends even in the single family market in terms of acquisitions and sales and increased home prices that are pricing more families out?
Maybe to approach that from a couple perspectives, perhaps the most important thing to know is that stock of single family homes that are affordable, those homes are aging with the people who bought them, typically older residents. There's some great work by Ben Winchester out of the U of M on our housing stock in our communities, and this kind of a single family question we've been talking a little bit about naturally occurring affordable housing. And if you look at Itasca, Couchiching, Lake, and Cook, 42 to 47% of all of our owner-occupied homes are owned by people in the boomer generation. So those homes are, you know, they're staying with those folks. That's a large supply of our affordable homes. But as you ask that question of kind of what is happening, what is going on with acquisitions, and I think one of the key things to reflect back on was a point that Gabriela noted earlier. We've had a 21% increase in renters since 2000 and almost no multifamily development. So it's not that we had that amount of, you know, vacant units those years, right? That is conversion of single family homes from the owner occupied market to the multifamily market. And if there's one thing important to know about that, it is in many ways stifling the ability of our single family, low to moderate income folks to find homes to purchase. At the same time, it is also creating markets where when those homes come online, when they go up for sale from that maybe aging population, there's a lot of competition from people who maybe aren't looking to even live in those homes. At the same time, there's of course competition with our low to moderate income buyers from folks who are maybe moderate to upper income. And so as we look at this, and at KOOTASCA, we operate a first-time home buyer program, and I sat down, you know, just a short while ago to talk with our home buyer counselors, and we're seeing those homes maybe that would have been $80,000 before COVID, maybe selling for $160,000. We're seeing so many of the homes outpacing the affordable interest rate loans that are available based on those LMI person's income or the down payment and cost assistance that we could provide them or that others could. So this market competition is really just outpricing so many people out of that market of what would be an affordable single family home. And obviously with COVID, it's a hot market. People are wanting to buy homes. Interest rates are at all-time lows. And we've had those low interest rates for a couple of years now. So many folks who maybe would have been thinking about selling their homes now are probably going to stick with it because they might have refinanced only 3 or 2 years ago. And for opportunities in the market, perhaps for low-income folks, it's to wait, try to save, and see if this won't be a bubble that will pass. And if you're perhaps a rental developer, it might be to build more rental housing or build more single-family housing if you can somehow make it work in the market.
Thanks, Isaac. Daryl, I wanted to ask you about, so Gabriela's research showed us that a lot of the NOAH properties in Duluth are located in the city's most affordable and most racially diverse neighborhoods. And that this is also where many of the NOAH property sales have occurred. And so if displacement had resulted, or if this is the current future trend and we do start to see more displacement, it's apparent that there are no or very few affordable opportunities in the same neighborhood, in the same community. Do you have any sense, or can you speak to what the city or the community is doing to address some of these inequitable outcomes, and how is it keeping equity in mind as it thinks through solutions?
Yeah, so I can speak on the level of what AICHO has been doing in regards to housing development. We currently have a 29 unit permanent supportive housing program. We also acquired a couple of years ago a 10 unit building in the east end of Duluth that we have developed into affordable housing. And we are working right now on a construction to increase our emergency shelter, or domestic violence shelter, from a 10 bed to a 24 bed unit. And then we have acquired a couple other properties in other areas of Duluth that lack housing. We'll be building kind of some studio or 1-2 bedroom apartments above an art gallery in the Lincoln Park area of Duluth. And we hope with that, we can also bring in some other employment opportunities. So have some on-the-job training skills. We've already started to work to kind of revitalize what was known as women in construction. We have some young women on our staff right now who have been learning that so that we can utilize that to develop further housing. And we're looking at trying to, we're working with a consulting team right now on a new development. We want to do another 50 units of permanent supportive housing. We've looked at several properties across Duluth. Now, on a city level, I think there's a variety of different things happening. There's been some work with purchasing hotels and turning them into permanent supportive housing, especially for singles and elders. There's a lot of individuals on our coordinated entry waiting list that are single individuals. There's also been conversations about looking at the new housing choice vouchers, or emergency vouchers, excuse me, that our local housing authority received recently, and kind of prioritizing how that could work if there's current permanent supportive housing programs that have an individual that maybe has been stable for a couple of years now and is ready to transition into the community, to maybe prioritize them to get one of those housing choice vouchers, so then we can open up some space for new folks who are on coordinated entry getting into PSH, where they may need more support services. And then I actually just had a conversation with a group this morning in regards to addressing youth homelessness in Duluth, and the bigger picture of that, because there's been talks over the years, but nothing really got rolling. And the reality is that there just isn't housing options for our youth. And there are so many unaccompanied and homeless youth in our community, as in everybody's communities, but there's not a way to address that. And my approach really with that and talking through it is, why aren't we addressing the systematic barriers? Like, why are youth not being reserved a certain amount of housing choice vouchers, specifically youth that have aged out of foster care? Because those housing choice vouchers are for youth who have aged out of foster care, but we don't see that being used in the same way in our communities, and it's not talked about. It's never approached with the housing authority, or looking at the whole system of coordinated entry and how that's a barrier to folks, especially our youth who may age out of foster care and go into a board and lodge. Well, that automatically disqualifies them to get on the coordinated entry list, because the board and lodge is considered housed, even though that's not a long-term solution for our community. So I think there's a lot of different conversations going on right now, and I hope that it will continue to be there. I also would like, and this is bigger picture city, but to look at all the vacant lots that our housing authority owns and bought up and has gone undeveloped, because that's land that could be developed. And maybe it's not the housing authority that has the ability to do that right now, but maybe there are other community partners that housing authorities across the state can partner with to utilize that land and create more affordable housing.
Thanks, Daryl. And Pam, I'm gonna throw you a new question, and feel free to tell me you're not prepared to answer, but what Daryl said struck me about the vacant lots that the HRA controls, and you have mentioned previously there's a lot of vacant properties and a lot of blight in the Duluth area. And so I'm curious if you agree with Daryl's recommendation, and can you speak to some of the challenges that there might be in developing on some of those lots? Because I know we've had numerous conversations just about, in addition to the lack of resources that are available to finance affordable housing in the area, and Gabriela's research tells us that too, with how just there's almost no new construction of affordable, but there's other unique challenges. I'm curious if you wanted to comment on kind of her last. Oh, you're muted.
So you would think I would know that by now. Sorry about that. Well, I will say that there are efforts now to really be looking at some of the vacant land and using that land for the tiny home developments. There's a proposal for a new model of affordable housing that would be supportive housing. And there's efforts to look at land, vacant land for that. And I had a conversation with one of the city staff this morning, and he was saying, send people his way. They're looking for developers, they're looking for ideas, they're looking for, independent contractors, finding ways that we can utilize more of our vacant properties, but also that we can get ideas like what you were talking about, Daryl, about construction programs. And I know also that Community Action Duluth is running a construction program. So I think there's some new opportunities for us to be doing more creative infill work. The challenges that we always face, and this is a challenge for low-income housing tax credit approvals in our community, is the cost with the rock, the slopes that we face, the age of the housing stock, if it's a conversion effort. So there are barriers to building in Duluth, and certainly higher costs to building in Duluth that are challenges. And so that's the downside. But I also think that there are some things that are being talked about. I know that one discussion that I've had with the city and LISC and the community working on an affordable housing trust fund is how do we look at smaller rental properties? How do we look at buildings that are never going to be financed with the tax credits? And, are there ways that we can be raising that funding? And this is what we'll be doing through the Minnesota Council on Foundations having low cost capital, for instance, or working with our lending institutions, or identifying models like Daryl talked about, with the reuse of the hotels. And today's story in the newspaper was about the Burnham building, which is the old county jail, and looking at that's being proposed for conversion. One thing that the mayor and the city have done is that they have started to use more tax increment financing to support affordable housing development, and requiring that a percentage of the housing that's built needs to be affordable. So making sure that there's ties like that. So I think we've got a long ways to go. And one of the challenges that I'm seeing and I'm hearing about too is that there's more people moving to our community who have more resources. So the prices are going up and there's competition for what housing stock we have. And that's something that we need to make sure that we are being as creative and resourceful and targeting the need for affordable housing in order to ensure that we don't continue to have these inequities in our housing market.
Thanks, Pam. And Isaac, I'm just curious to kind of go off of this issue of barriers and cost. a portion of the report highlighted a little bit more about the issues related to Duluth, but can you provide insight into why new construction is lagging elsewhere in the region? So if you don't have a bedrock issue, what is causing the region to just lag with new development? And what kind of pressures is putting on the existing affordable housing stock and influencing what type of housing that is being developed?
Yeah, it probably all comes back to the golden rule for housing development. It's not built where there's demand, but where it's most profitable, right? And when we look at that, what it ultimately means, it comes down to a question of, what can people pay for rent, and what does the market look like for rental prices? And when we get to these questions of what can people pay, you really run into this challenge with Northland, Minnesota. As the report noted, we have the lowest median wage. AICHO being the lowest in the state for our renters. So you have very little impetus for developers to want to build an apartment here when they could just as easily build one somewhere else, say in the cities, an urban area. And that is a market breakdown. I mean, it's one we've long known about. We've had an affordable housing crisis across the nation, but this issue becomes maybe particularly a challenge for northern Minnesota, because not only do we lack developers who might take on these larger projects, a single family subdivision or a multifamily apartment, but we also lack contractors. The Northland region has about half the rate of contractors per 1,000 residents as the state as a whole. Now, rural Minnesota suffers a little bit there compared to the metro region, but the Northland particularly suffers here. And so when we get down to a pure question of, well, who's going to build that home? Who's going to do that work? We're behind. And that lack of skilled labor is important, because we struggle, KOOTASCA, we do a lot of home rehab projects here as well. We struggle just to get contractors to do smaller jobs, do that little bit of work that might be needed. And a perhaps actual insight that I hope to provide to all of this is that when you look at our region, geographically, we are isolated in a way that the rest of the state is not. We are geographically isolated in a way that much of our nation does not face at all. To our east, we have Lake Superior, and to our north, we have the Canadian border. And if you live someplace that's not geographically bounded, you might go north, east, south, or west to find a developer, to find a builder, to go buy groceries, or to do anything else in your life. And so when it comes to all of these questions of just generally engaging with our communities, we are kind of blocked off on two sides to go anywhere. And so those folks who might have an interest in developing that next multifamily apartment or building the next subdivision, well, they're not going to come across Lake Superior, and they're not going to cross that Canadian border. So we are landlocked in many ways there, and that puts on a type of pressure that does not exist, that our state doesn't really pay attention to or seek to address. And given all the other factors we have, particularly with poverty, all we know is that the market is not necessarily going to solve this unless we can adapt and change our market. And there are maybe some exciting things that might come out of people realizing the challenges with COVID and the additional pain that was brought to the entire market when our, I guess I would say, shock absorber of our low-income renters was taken out, right? When we could no longer just evict anyone who's poor, everyone else in the market began to experience what it felt like to struggle to find that housing, or to realize, well, rents are so high, maybe I should buy that home. And so in the Northland region, we've just had all of that compounded because of our long history, right, of lack of development of any kind, and our conversion of our homes of one type to another market with essentially a long pattern of our affordability continuing to drop. And gosh, it doesn't look good, but as you think about, what is being developed, it's whatever type of housing can be, can make it in the market. So there used to be lots of single family units right back in the 80s, single bedroom units back in the 80s. We see a lot more 2 bedrooms now. And obviously the state really pushes for 3 and 4 bedrooms for any affordable housing. So what gets built is either what the state allows or what the market can provide. So it's maybe not a great picture, but obviously we've got a lot of people working on it, and the enhanced energy is hopefully going to bring us some solutions.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. Oh, I think I'm echoing. I have so many more questions for you and that I could ask you. This has been very insightful, and I so appreciate you taking a moment to join MHP this afternoon. I want to turn it over to Gabriela just to see if she had any closing comments or what to look forward to next. I know she told us that she's got a few communities that she's looking at, but wanted to let Gabriela have the last word, as this is really a product of many years of her work.
Thanks, Libby. I just really want to thank everybody who attended this call, especially our panelists. I think you guys have provided such important, critical expertise and insight into, your on the ground work. So I'm really, really thankful that you all were able to join. And I think I would just say, feel free to connect with me. I think I had my email in one of the slides. I'm happy to share out the slides as well, if that's helpful. But yeah, definitely feel free to follow up with me if you have any other questions or kind of more detailed questions about the data. I'm very happy to talk things through. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.